So first, let's bring in our experts tonight. Joining us in our Crime Time segment, Lieutenant Colonel Adam Lee, Assistant Chief Jailer and former Chief of the Major Crime Section. Adam served as a police officer for 30 years as the Chief of the Major Crimes Unit. He oversaw homicide cases, robberies, special victims units, and a gun assault team. And also joining us, retired director of the San Diego Police Department Crime Lab, Jennifer Shen. Jennifer has 30 years of experience with law enforcement as a forensic scientist. She's an expert in police procedure regarding forensic evidence collection, preservation, processing, and storage, and spent 15 years working on active crime scenes. Great to have you both with us tonight. We appreciate it. Let's get right to our first story, which is a pastor arrested for holding service. This comes to us from WFTS in Tampa.
The Hillsborough County Sheriff says the pastor at the River at Tampa Bay Church put a lot of people in danger by blatantly disobeying social distancing. This video is from the service yesterday morning, where an estimated 400 to 500 people crowded into the sanctuary. We tried to reach out to the church for a statement, but we were directed to their website, where they say the church should be listed as an essential service, just like hospitals and police. The sheriff says the pastor was warned not to do this, but chose to do it anyway. The sheriff's office says this violates Hillsborough County's Safer at Home order and that the pastor, Rodney Howard Brown, broke the law in doing so.
His reckless disregard for human life put hundreds of people in his congregation at risk and thousands of residents who may interact with them this week in danger.
The pastor is charged with misdemeanors for unlawful assembly and violation of a public health emergency order.
These times are different, but my first question tonight, have you ever arrested a pastor for holding service? Lieutenant Colonel Adam Lee, this is unusual.
Highly unusual, Vinny. Personally, I have never arrested a pastor, but in this case, I believe I would. I mean, our biggest problem right now in this country is our second biggest problem is people's lack of respect for the virus. It's starting to be really frustrating, I'm sure, to all the first responders that are dealing with this, having to tackle this situation and having to fight not only the virus, but people who just refuse to not believe that it's true. Just a week ago, I didn't know anybody that knew anybody that was affected by this. But now this week, I know 3 people who have lost friends or family to this virus. So the reality is starting to show and it's starting to really show up.
Jennifer Shen, the other part of this is you force an arrest. Now that police officer who has to make the arrest is at risk as well, as is everyone in booking, and the people have to take the mug shots and everything else associated with arresting someone.
That is true. And I find this so shocking because, not only did he put all of his congregation at risk, he put all of their families at risk, and then his town, where all of the people that he associates with every day, he put all of them at risk. And I just don't understand it. I think what we're seeing here is someone who is not taking the virus seriously. And we have to. The next 2 weeks are going to be tough, and everybody has to do their part. And that includes pastors of church who people really rely on. There's a lot of other things you can do. You can do this using Zoom or, doing a lot of sort of online type interaction with your congregation. And that's what he needs to do here.
Let's take a listen to the sheriff from down in Hillsborough County who spoke with us earlier, talking about, his reaction to all of this, because I guess you don't want to arrest a pastor. You don't want to have to, but he seemed a little upset, to say the least.
I would never exercise discretion when speaking for law enforcement across the entire country. But I have to tell you what, I feel pretty confident. Like us, most law enforcement during the declared state of emergency, a pandemic, this national medical emergency that we're all facing, they don't want to arrest anybody. They want to focus on education. And that's what we're focused on. Our deputies are out there focusing on business that maybe shouldn't be open and explaining to them why, and they close down. Approaching a group of 35 individuals who are playing basketball, explaining to them the dangers of that they're putting themselves in and others, and they're breaking up and agreeing, and they leave. We gave this individual every opportunity over a 3-day period to comply with the provisions set forth in this emergency order, and he was adamant about being defiant in the order, leaving us with no choice. And I say this all the time: shame on him, his attorney, and his church leaders for forcing us during the time of declared emergency, forcing us to do our job.
Lieutenant Colonel, how much discretion or choice does a member of law enforcement have? I mean, because he said he left us no choice.
In this situation, Vinny, there are so many people that are hurting across the country and dying. And I would imagine that this sheriff in this situation felt that he had no choice. To not take action would pretty much be condoning the actions of this pastor. There's another pastor in Louisiana in a similar situation that was arrested yesterday, I believe. So this has to come to a stop. We're starting to learn that many people that are being infected now are being infected by attending such gatherings, church gatherings, funerals. I mean, it's starting to get to the point where we have just really got to adhere to social distancing to make.
All right, let's take a listen to the pastor himself. He did respond publicly about what is taking place here.
I'm not ashamed to be arrested for the First Amendment of the United States, which I know other people think I was getting arrested for other things. I mean, you can make up whatever charges you want to. Ultimately, I was being arrested for the First Amendment, and that's it. And I know the sheriff said we can't hide behind the First Amendment, but we can, because I was sworn in as a citizen of the Constitutional Republic of the United States, and I raised my hand to pledge to defend the Constitution of America against enemies, foreign or domestic.
You know, Jennifer, some would argue that the enemy here is the invisible enemy that we're fighting, and part of that fight is to not do what he was doing. His response to me is unreal here.
I agree. And you're not allowed to run into a crowded building and yell fire either, right? So when you have a situation like this where you are putting people at risk, people can die from being exposed, then you have, I mean, it's just shameful. It is absolutely shameful. I'm so surprised that he would go ahead with a group like this. So many people in such a small place, just absolutely unacceptable.
And Lieutenant Colonel, the other part of what's happening now, we know what a stress this entire situation is putting on law enforcement coast to coast, because members of law enforcement are quarantined. The numbers are down. They're working longer hours. Every time they leave the house, they have to interact with people. And then you have someone like this who is bringing hundreds of people together and now creating more of a situation. To me, you know, you don't want to do it because, yeah, people are going to church. But at the end of the day, this is a true safety issue, and that's the first job of law enforcement, is to serve and protect.
Vinny, and from both the pastor here that we're talking about and the other pastor in Louisiana are threatening to actually hold church services again this Sunday. So it's almost like they are trying to become martyrs and heroes amongst their parishioners there, and it's not going to end good. I predict that there are going to be some parishioners that are going to fall ill in both of these congregations if they keep this up.
All right, when we come back, more crime time. We've got an amazing story with this girl escaping from a situation that was so horrific. A family massacred inside, yet somehow she is able to escape. We'll talk about that next.
New York City is trying to reduce the density in those playgrounds. Thus far, they have not been successful If that continues, we'll take a mandatory action to close down playgrounds.
And the other part of all this is involving law enforcement in trying to enforce this social distancing. It's another one of the stories we're covering tonight in our Crime Time segment. Bringing our own experts. Still with us tonight, Lieutenant Colonel Adam Lee and Jennifer Shen helping us out, giving us some perspective. Let's get right to that next story, which is a crackdown on social distancing, coming to us from WPIX in New York.
Walk on the streets of New York City these days and you'll see few people walking around, a dismal sign of the times. Here in Brooklyn this morning, some New Yorkers were armed with masks and gloves and practicing social distancing, doing their part to stop the spread of COVID-19. But there were some who weren't keeping 6 feet apart. The mayor on the Pix 11 News this morning saying fines up to $500 can now be issued to those not following this new norm.
At this point, after all the education, all the warnings, there's any New Yorkers out there who are not practicing social distancing, then what our police will do and our other enforcement agencies will give them one last warning, and they'll say, if you don't comply right now, you're going to get a fine.
Still, many shoppers at this grocery store in the Bronx were seemingly more focused on their food than keeping their space. A concerned Pix 11 viewer took this cell phone video.
It's kind of hard in supermarkets and enclosed spaces. You got to try to keep your best yourself to stay away from people.
We caught up with Jaquan De Jesus outside of a grocery store in Queens, where employees were making only a few people go in to shop at a time.
We should all do a little bit of our part to help stop this.
This as parks and playgrounds remain open, but are being monitored closely by the NYPD. The governor today saying if people are at them for too long in groups and are not social distancing, they will be shut down too.
New York City is trying to reduce the density in those playgrounds. Thus far, they have not been successful. If that continues, we'll take a mandatory action to close down playgrounds.
How would you enforce this? That's my first question coming out of this one. Lieutenant Colonel Adam Lee, this is one, we lost Adam. All right, Jennifer Shen is still with us. Jennifer, how would you enforce this? This is difficult because you're talking about police, ordinary citizens, and basically all they're doing is getting too close to each other.
Yeah, and it's really difficult. I mean, I think that people don't realize when they're not paying attention to these rules and they force a city government or a state government to have to use these kinds of actions, and they're taking those first responders away from duties that are so much more significant. And the other thing I think people don't really realize is that the downstream effect. So if you're not social distancing and then you have to have interaction with the first responders, I mean, who are you putting at risk by your behavior? And the more people who are sick, the more that, that's a problem for our healthcare and our doctors and our nurses, et cetera. So it's such a selfish thing at this time. What can we do? This is what everyone can do, and everyone should be doing it.
Yeah, and it seemed that the mayor of New York is talking about, okay, you get a warning first, and then if you don't comply, then right there on the spot. That's going to be an uncomfortable situation for law enforcement. I mean, that's going to be a very delicate balance, isn't it?
I would think so, yes. I mean, I think it's a great way to go, to do the warning first. I mean, there's some people that maybe they just don't really understand. And once they've been warned and they know they could face some sort of law enforcement repercussion, that will do the trick. And I would imagine it would for the vast majority of people who are not doing this still. But at the end of the day, we're trying to save people's lives. And that's what police officers do. They try to save people's lives, and they're just doing it in this way a little differently than they're used to.
Lieutenant Colonel, we've got you back. How would you approach someone at this stage if you were out on the street, working the streets, and you're trying to get people to create that distance that they're not creating? How would you approach them?
I would certainly use a large amount of decorum. We're all in a stressful, scary situation now, but people have to understand, as we discussed earlier, this is to save lives. All of our lives are at stake at this point, not just the average person or the old people or the people who have compromised immune systems. You know, it's everybody. Everybody who has a relative who has a compromised immune system or an elderly relative. They're putting their people at risk at this point. They need to understand that.
All right, let's get to our next story, which comes to us from KTNV in Las Vegas. A girl escapes a family massacre.
Yeah, Nina, the scene is still very active hours after this shooting that left 3 people dead. You can see the area right around Chasing Hart Way is still closed down as police collect evidence and try to put the pieces together here. What we do know is that around 10:30 last night, police got a call that someone's neighbor was firing a gun inside of his house. Homicide officer Ray Spencer says that the dispatcher could hear those shots on the call. When police got here, they say that a teenage girl was climbing out of a window to get away. She told police that her 2 brothers were still inside, so police had to act quickly.
Obviously, you know, it's a life or death type situation. We knew that there was gunfire inside the house. It was an immediate activation of our SWAT team. As soon as our SWAT team made arrival, they do what they call as a hostage rescue. They made entry into the house.
Spencer says, sadly, that they found the father and his 2 teenage sons' bodies inside. Police believe that the dad killed his 2 sons and then turned the gun on himself before police arrived. Spencer says that the girl was not hurt and that the mom wasn't home. While it's not clear what led up to this shooting, Spencer says that this lasting shutdown is causing a lot of stress in families. He says that you can call the Family Justice Center or a therapist at 211 to get help before it escalates to this level. Now, Spencer says that this scene is extensive and will need processing. He says that the area will be shut down until around noon.
So you've got 3 bodies here. How do you figure out who shot who inside that home? Jennifer Shen, what type of evidence are you looking for inside to figure this out?
Well, that's a crime scene that's going to have a lot of evidence, and there's several things that you can do, starting with just the positioning of the bodies. Where did they fall, and does that seem reasonable that that was a murder-suicide or some sort of self-defense? We can look for where was the weapon located. Again, if where the weapon was located, it may or may not seem reasonable that the father used it to kill himself. And we're going to look for trajectories. Where did the bullets come from? Where did they land? Are there fired cartridge cases so that we can see where people were standing, where the shooter was standing when he shot the weapon? And the last thing we can do is we can look at the weapon itself and look for fingerprints, DNA, and look at the victims and the shooter's hands to see if there's any gunshot residue on them. So all those things together will really tell a story as to what happened here.
Lieutenant Colonel Adam Lee, what's it like when you're responding to a scene like this and you've got a teenage girl who is escaping and you know you've got 2 boys in there, her siblings are inside. How do you handle that?
That's a tough one, especially when you're gonna have a distraught young lady there. I'm sure she lost her 2 brothers and her father, but you just can't assume anything. I actually worked at a homicide scene where I thought was a homicide scene a few years ago. It turned out to be a suicide scene. The guy actually shot himself twice, and so we automatically assumed that it was a homicide because how often do you see somebody shoot themselves twice? So you really have to be meticulous in going through everything that Jennifer just said. The trajectories, was the gun still in the father's hand when they got there? Fingerprints, stippling, that's the gunpowder residue on contact wounds. Is he right-handed? Is he left-handed? Where is he shot? There's so many different things to look at when it comes to determining who shot who.
All right. Great job again tonight. Great to have our experts on hand. We really appreciate Lieutenant Colonel Adam Lee and Jennifer Shen. Great job. Stay safe, folks out there. We appreciate it.